We want to take you to another place where there were demonstrations today. There was a big protest in the capital of Ohio, in Columbus. Our NBC affiliate WCMH has reported it was overall peaceful, which is what we heard from most cities today, until just a short time ago. And then protesters had a confrontation with police. The incident alarmed the crowd, and pepper spray was dispersed with no warning. That's according to Congresswoman Joyce Beatty, who was among those who were hit with the pepper spray. And the Ohio National Guard has been activated in the city, which is under a citywide curfew until 6 o'clock Sunday morning. Joining us now is Representative Joyce Beatty. She is a Democrat who represents Ohio's 3rd District. She's also vice chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. I'm so glad to see you. Let me just ask you to take us into that moment. Where were you and what happened?
Well, I was in the capital city and certainly went there to show my solidarity for those protesters. We all are feeling so much tension, so much frustration and anger, especially in light of what just happened in Minnesota with George Floyd, what happened in Georgia with Mohammed Arbery, and in Kentucky. So I went there because it was the right thing to do. It was a peaceful protest. Under no circumstances am I one to support tearing up our communities, our cities, breaking into businesses. It was a 2-hour protest. I was there with 2 other colleagues. We went together. People were happy to see us. We were able actually to be helpful, asking people to stand on the sidewalks, to not get in the street. And shortly before the 12 o'clock noon hour, when police were deployed there, all of a sudden it was several of the police were fine. Another string of police came through, and if one person had a foot on the curb, they started going into riot mode, in my opinion, and pushing and shoving with bicycles. And then once one guy was thrown on the ground, there were some young sisters there that I was trying to talk to. I was trying to identify myself and say, don't excite the crowd. And there goes the guy down. And then I'm saying, no, this is wrong. Stop, because I knew what would happen with the protesters. And before we knew it, pepper spray went everywhere. Our president of city council was sprayed. I received some of it. And so at that point, I was taken away.
Yeah, we saw some of the pictures that were shot by our local affiliate, and we see your eyes being wiped out. But I just want to make clear, you said you clearly identified yourself and there was nothing going on that would indicate to you that there was a need for pepper spray, nor any warning that it was coming?
There was no warning that I heard of it coming, because certainly we would have moved. I mean, that's not an experience that you want to have, pepper spray in your eyes and inhaling it. But it happened so fast. But I just think because of the tension on both sides, it was clearly not all of the law enforcement, but the strand of officers that were there in front of us. People were not throwing rocks or bottles. There was no excitement until there were a few of the protesters who put one foot in the street at the point, and it just started. And it was so upsetting. I'm still emotionally upset about it, because I think being out there and protesting was the right thing to do. But we have to come together. It has to be peaceful. It has to be allowing people to exercise their freedom of speech. All lives matter, but Black lives matter. We were asking people to stand with us against injustices. We know about the disparities in the capital city. We are now going through the coronavirus, the pandemic. There are so many disparities. African Americans make up 12% of the population. 25% of the people have tested positive. 13% of the African American population has died from this. We are releasing statements about poverty. It's based on racism. There's so much going on today in our community and across the nation. This is a time for us to stand in solidarity. This is a time for us to unite, because what happens directly to any of us happens to all of us indirectly.
So as a member of Congress, you have a lot of contacts. You work closely on any number of issues with local officials. Have you tried to get any answers for why what happened, or have you gotten any indication of how it came to pepper spray?
I have not. Certainly ministers in the community, people from all over my district have reached out. Young protesters have called and reached out. We are just trying to stand together and work through this. I have talked with other elected officials explaining why I was there, how I still want to work with everyone. I believe in unity. I sit on the House floor with John Lewis every day, and we talk about getting into good trouble. And that's what it was, going down there to stand up and to fight against people are being murdered. It has taken us back some 60 years to when we were fighting for civil rights and voting rights. And here we are in 2020. I identified myself to be helpful, to say, don't excite the crowds. You know, don't excite the crowds. We're working with you. And saying also to the protesters, continue to exercise your First Amendment right. Continue to be able to say that we're standing here and we're protesting against the injustices.
Well, one of the things that unfortunately is getting lost in all of these reports of what we've been seeing tonight and earlier in the day and some of the police activity is the fact that there is a man at the center of this by the name of George Floyd, that his family and the people, the vast majority of people who have come out are simply asking for justice. Congresswoman Beatty, thank you so much. We do appreciate it, and we're glad to see that you're back home and that you are safe. And we look forward to many more conversations that are focused on exactly what needs to change in this country so we don't have to see these kinds of protests again. Thank you so much for being with us. We do appreciate it. Hello, I'm Chris Jansing. It is coming up on midnight on the East Coast, 11 p.m. in Minneapolis, where another night of protests raged there and in dozens of other cities around America over the death of 46-year-old George Floyd, a black man who was killed after a white police officer held his knee on George Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes and for nearly 3 minutes after he had stopped breathing. Multiple governors have activated the National Guard, and curfews have been enacted in several major cities across America, including Atlanta, Louisville, Denver, and Milwaukee. But at least some of those curfews have been ignored by demonstrators. Minneapolis is bracing for unrest that state and local officials have warned could be more violent and more destructive than anything the city has seen so far. In Washington, D.C., NBC's Garrett Haake describes the scene as riot territory as people smashed store windows and burned at least one car. And New York City Police Department has arrested more than 100 people during protests. 15 police vehicles have been burned in Manhattan and Brooklyn, and the mayor held a press conference just a short time ago with a message for protesters saying it's time to go home. An initially peaceful protest in Miami turned violent, with some demonstrators setting fire to police cars. And in Chicago, demonstrators swarmed Trump Tower. Earlier tonight, Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot forcefully denounced protesters who came for, quote, all-out battle.
I want to express my disappointment and really my total disgust at the number of others who came to today's protest armed for all-out battle. You don't come to a peaceful protest with a bowling ball or a hammer or a shovel or a baseball bat. You don't come to a peaceful protest with bottles of urine to throw at police officers. I applaud the vast majority of the individuals who came here to make true and lasting change peacefully.
Joining me now is MSNBC's Ali Velshi, who has been on the ground in Minneapolis throughout this crisis. And now it is midnight here, 11 o'clock, just after 11 o'clock Central Time. Give us a lay of the land and what you've been seeing since we last spoke to you 15 or 20 minutes ago.
Well, things have changed quite dramatically in downtown Minneapolis. We're now downtown. We've come here. We're at the intersection of North First Avenue and Fifth Street, North Fifth Street, if anybody knows downtown Minneapolis. And as you can see, it actually is empty. There have been police, or some police over there. There have been police vehicles going around the city with National Guard, generally speaking, with the backup of National Guard. They have moved to areas where people have been convening. There was a crowd, as you know, the crowd that I was with of a few thousand. That appears to have dispersed, and any little gatherings are being broken up by police. Now, they did that very effectively earlier by firing tear gas and tracers and rubber bullets into the crowd, which also hit us earlier, but it has had the desired effect of enforcing the curfew in Minneapolis. The other thing that we saw happen was because of that, you saw National Guard escorting firefighters. So we have not seen the fires tonight that we've seen in the last few nights. So, and when the fires of the last few nights have not been able to be put out because the firefighters were not able to go in without the protection of the National Guard. As you know, there are many more National Guard. All police leave has been canceled. All paid time off for police, firefighters, EMT has been canceled in Minneapolis. So everybody is on the job right now. And as a result, they've got a handle on the fires. We saw an ambulance being escorted by the National Guard. We saw fire trucks, several of them. I think when you and I started to talk about an hour ago, we saw several of the fire trucks being escorted by the National Guard. There are still some fires. There is still some protest activity around the city, but it seems to have largely died down. This is a city that has been dealing with protests Tuesday night, Thursday night, and then again Friday night, and then tonight. But again, tonight was a peaceful protest. There wasn't looting. There wasn't smashing of anything going on, and the police have taken the most aggressive role that they have taken all week. The government, the governor, the mayors of St. Paul and of Minneapolis and others have said that they are bringing in the reinforcements to keep the streets of Minneapolis quiet tonight, and it looks, Chris, like they have achieved that.
All right, well, that is one good thing, a little peace on the streets, but there are going to be a lot of after-action questions that are going to be asked tomorrow for sure. We, again, are so glad you are okay and your crew's okay, and we are grateful for you being out there to report for us, Ali Velshi. Thank you. We also want to go to New York City now because there's been a lot of activity there as well. We're waiting to get Richard Louie up, but do we have a picture yet? Do we have the picture? So there, what you're saying, that's obviously a lot of a heavy police presence there. Do we have Richard Louie yet?
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes,
Chris,
I can hear you.
Me?
Thanks, Richard. What's going on?
All right. Chris, we have a person on the right-hand side here who was injured. I don't know, Ronnie, if you can pull to the right on the ground here. There's been really quiet. It got very small in number, and then all of a sudden bottles were thrown, projectiles were thrown, and then the police again moved towards the crowd, and there are at least 3 or 4 individuals that fell to the ground. You can see one right there at the moment. So what was a very quiet, if you came to us 10 minutes ago, you could hear a pin drop, but as you know, with these protests, as they disperse them, 15 or 20 minutes later, they come back. They come back. And so we have one individual here who is injured that we just walked past. And the police now are trying to get everybody away from the same intersection that we were in before, when we were on air together, when the crowd ran towards us. So we're in the very same location at the moment. And it is another flashpoint. And on an evening like this, a Saturday night, where it's warm and there is no curfew, as you know, unlike some of the other cities that you've been following this evening, we have seen the crowds ebb and flow. And so, like I said, just 15 minutes ago, quiet. If you talk to us at sunset, quiet. But now here in Brooklyn, as we are on the outskirts of downtown, not too far away from Barclays Center, you can see roughly about 100 officers confronting a group that's not that large, a group, though, that has confronted the police occasionally, a bottle of water or some small projectile, and then the police decide to pursue that individual. What has been pretty consistent here, Chris, is that as groups are gathering, if they are in the streets, and if they so decide, they ask them to step out of the streets, and then the groups are allowed to stay on the sidewalk. What has been consistent, and this is not unique to Brooklyn, certainly, Chris, is that the protesters are quite, some of them, not all of them, because you understand the diversity of all of these groups in terms of different intensities, that the ones in front clearly screaming out obscenities, challenges for confrontation, that certainly does not help the situation. But at this moment, we have seen at least one injured, which you saw earlier on camera that we walked past. We're now at what I guess would be the front line, again, where the police are with what is now a very small group, as you can tell, maybe about 50 or 60 protesters. So another quiet moment, potentially, Chris? Maybe not.
You mentioned, Richard, some of the exchanges that have been going on. Can you hear me okay, Richard?
I can.
Let's see if we can hear any of this. I want to see if we can hear any of this.
Okay, go ahead. We'll go on Pam that one.
It's just general, it sounds like just general yelling between some of the protesters and the police.
Orders, or we will do the fuck out of you. We are recording every day. You are not getting clear orders.
Let's go. Move. You got to step out of it.
It seems, Richard Louis, for all the yelling, that the police were not provoked and people are moving now.
Yes, that's right, Chris. Up to this point, when we've seen that sort of confrontation, all of a sudden it would flash. And of course, we're a little bit over midnight right now. And so the intensity is certainly accelerated. As you've seen in these situations in other cities, you can see here that now the captain is here leading in front, trying to get all the protesters to take a step back. His officers behind him. But it looks like all of the protesters, or the majority of them, are now taking steps back and listening to law enforcement. We're following them to see what might happen, but it certainly is a stark contrast to what you saw, 9 minutes ago? And that was the change. Like I said, if you took our camera just moments ago, before the top of the hour, quiet, and everybody was dispersed. But after it dispersed, everybody returned. So here we are in front of a very iconic, if you're a Brooklynite, you know Junior's. It's one of the favorite eateries just down the block. And this happens to be the location, perhaps from today's history, that these Brooklynites will remember. So a quiet moment for a second at least, Chris.
Get on the sidewalk.
Well, let's hope it stays that way. You take good care, you and your crew. Richard Louis, we'll get back to you as the situation warrants. Thank you so much for that. As he pointed out, there is no curfew in effect in New York City. That is not the case in Los Angeles, where the National Guard is deploying as looting, vandalism, and violence is worsening. I want to bring in Paul Koretz. He is a member of the Los Angeles City Council, representing the 5th Council District. Thank you so much for being with us. What are you hearing about the situation in your city tonight?
Well, most of the violence and vandalism has taken place in my district and, in fact, in my neighborhood, which is the Fairfax area. And we're all devastated about the senseless and vicious death of George Floyd, but I think the message has been completely eclipsed by the violence and vandalism that we're seeing. Just about every building is graffitied. Many are broken into. Some have been set on fire. Police cars and other vehicles have been set on fire. And we're trying to get this under control. I've called for, and we've gotten a curfew. I asked for it to be in this neighborhood, but it's now citywide, which is great. I've asked, and we have now requested support from the National Guard and our neighboring sheriff's department, and we're doing everything we can to protect our residents.
Do you have a sense, Councilman, at this time, what specifically, if there is something specific, or who may have sparked this level of violence?
It's not really clear. It's probably a combination of people's anger towards what happened and the fact that people are angry anyway because they've been cooped up due to coronavirus. We really just began opening the city, and this weekend was supposed to be when our retail stores and our restaurants would be open for the first time this weekend. So I think there's a lot of anger in the air in general. And I don't know how many people were participating in this looking for violence. I think most of the people intended to protest peacefully. And I know our police officers responded to that in that way and have done a very good job of balancing the rights of peaceful protesters and at the same time making sure we protect against those that are intent upon committing crimes. So it's been difficult, but we have mobilized our entire force. We have thousands of officers in the Fairfax area. We're doing whatever we can to get a handle on this. Fortunately, there really hasn't been a lot of physical damage to people. There haven't been any deaths. There haven't been a lot of protesters injured. I've seen several LAPD officers that have been injured and have been taken away by ambulance, which is quite unfortunate. But nobody, I believe, has their lives threatened from what's happened today. I think that's part of the effectiveness of a better LAPD than we had when we had the terrible things that happened to Rodney King, which set the city on fire and on edge 28 years ago. We want to make sure that doesn't happen to this city again, and we don't take decades to recover from it.
You mentioned some of the activity that was going on. I'm just checking some of the reporting in the LA Times, Councilman. They report that Nordstrom and the Apple store at the Grove, which is a big, well-known shopping area there, were vandalized and looted. That somebody took a hammer to the front of the Whole Foods right there. And while some people were cheering, other people were screaming, "Don't do that, please." So obviously you have some people who are inciting problems. Other people who are there peacefully don't want to see what is happening happen. Do you feel confident now that you're in a situation in Los Angeles where you have on the ground what you need to control the situation?
It's not completely clear, especially if it spreads to other areas. We're controlling it as well as we possibly can. We have a lot of iconic shopping areas within a short distance of each other, all in my neighborhood. We have the Grove, we have the Beverly Center, the Beverly Connection, Farmers Market, we have CBS Studios, we have Cantor's Deli. We have a lot of very notable sites, and they're all in danger. So we're trying to keep those all protected. We're trying to keep our residents protected. We're trying to keep all the small business storefronts protected, but that is a lot of activity. So while I think we're handling it as well as we can, I wouldn't say we're out of the woods. I think it's important that we called the curfew and that we're enforcing it. But as this protest moves to other areas, I think we need to be as well prepared and even more active in making sure it doesn't spread the way it has today.
And we're seeing a large fire burning in Los Angeles where it is 9:17 p.m. One of the many, and there are obviously fire crews on the scene. And I don't see that in that area that there are any signs of protesters, but we don't have a large, wide shot of that area. One of the things that Mayor Garcetti said today, Councilman, when you watch these pictures of the protests, you're only occasionally struck by the fact that we're still in the middle of a pandemic. And there are people who are wearing masks, but plenty of people who are not, and people who have masks but are pulling them down. And one of the things that the mayor said he was worried about was the obvious lack of social distancing. This is a city who, like much of California and like much of the country, has worked hard to come back and be able to reopen in the middle of a pandemic. How worried are you about what we might see 2 weeks after these protests with potentially a spike in cases?
Well, I'm very worried, and I'm already frustrated. I led the effort to require masks anytime people leave the home. And it took a while longer, perhaps, than it should have, but we did put out that order. I have seen a lot of non-compliance with that. And I fear it's because as we decide to open up, that people don't realize that putting on masks and social distancing actually will make that more possible and make spread less likely. And rather, they're looking at it and saying, well, everything's okay. If we can open retail and open restaurants, I guess we don't need to do this anymore. But I'm very fearful that large gatherings like this, everybody crowded into one place, mostly not wearing masks, could encourage this spread. And not all of our officers had masks either. I think it's not a recipe for good health.
Well, Councilman, it is a beautiful city and an incredibly beautiful neighborhood that you live in Fairfax, and we wish you the best. We will keep our eye on what's developing in Los Angeles. We thank you very much, Councilman Koretz, for being with us tonight. We want to go now to Atlanta, where Blaine Alexander is standing by, where there is a state of emergency that was expanded earlier today. What's going on the streets of Atlanta tonight, Blaine?
State of emergency here, Chris. The governor is authorizing as many as 1,500 National Guard troops to come out and help keep the peace. And that's because of really what we saw as a bunch of chaos last night. I want to show you, though, it is a very different mood here tonight than what we saw last night. If you kind of look over here, this is a big part of the reason why these barriers were put in place, because this area behind me, you see the plywood, you see the broken out windows. This was one of the first places to get hit by protesters. We're standing here in downtown Atlanta. This is right by the iconic CNN Center. You can see down there, that's the area where the red CNN sign is and where it was defaced. So we actually see a big difference here tonight for two reasons. One, resources. We know that there are more National Guard agents here, National Guard officials rather. You can look over here. You can kind of see some of the vehicles, see some of Atlanta police officers who are still going through and working to clear the streets. The other thing is that stricter rules were put into place tonight, Chris. We have a 9 p.m. curfew that's in effect for Atlanta. And we know that really about 10 minutes or so before 9 o'clock, we saw those armored vehicles. We saw them actually announcing, saying, hey, you've got 10 minutes. You are going to be arrested if you don't disperse. It was after that that we saw tear gas go into the crowd. It was after that that we kind of saw this clash between protesters and police. But I've got to say that it was so much more contained than this time last night. Now, I do need to say that right now there is one Atlanta police officer who is in the hospital being treated because of the very almost like a skirmish that we saw earlier tonight. Police had mostly cleared the streets. They'd largely cleared the streets, but there was a rider on an ATV who ran into an officer at a high rate of speed. We're told that that officer sustained significant injuries, and he is in stable condition tonight here, Chris.
All right, Blaine Alexander in Atlanta for us. We're also showing you the picture of that fire that is raging in Los Angeles. And we have seen in cities across America those flashing lights of police vehicles, of fire vehicles, as some fiery clashes between police and protesters spread across the country, an intensifying of the standoff over the death of George Floyd. We have our correspondents throughout the country. We'll continue to follow this breaking news through the evening. We'll take a quick break and be back with more on MSNBC.